In this video, you're going to start the process of serving files to the user. So first of all, you will need to get the file extension. So the file extension can be found in the name of the file, which you can get from the full path name if you like, or the path name itself. So both end with the name of the file, including its extension. So let's go ahead and create a variable extension name, which we will set to the extension of our file. So to get the extension, you can use the path module with the method extension name. So we're just going to pass to it the full static path like that. Now to make our code easier to read, you can create an object and call it file details. And then you can add to this object properties that you want. So for example, you can add the property extension name like that. So let's console.log the extension name and see what we get. So let's try this file, and you can see the extension name .mp4. Let's try this one, and you can see .mp3. So it keeps loading there because we're not sending any response in this scenario, so that's absolutely fine. Now, in order for the browser to read your file, you may need to add a content type to your response header. Instead of relying on the browser to guess the content type from the extension, you can do that in your code to make sure that the type is always correct. So to get the MIME type, we're going to create a function get MIME type, which will take the extension name we created earlier, or we extracted earlier, and will return a promise. So once we execute this function, we can use the then statements like this. And let's say that we get a variable MIME. So you're going to write a function here, which will do something with the MIME type. So for now, we're just going to console.log MIME. And we'll need to handle the errors by adding a catch statement at the end like this. So if anything wrong happens here, we're going to consider it as a server internal error. So in that case, the status code you can use here or send to the user is 500. That's the status code you would normally use for an internal server error. Now, in the response, we will send something like 500 internal server error. You can also console.log this to the console. So like that. Or let's do something better. Promise error. All right, and then you return the response.end. Now, to keep our code structured, we will create this function getMIMEType in a separate file. So we're going to create it in the same folder containing respond.js. So let's add it to the file imports, and we're going to call it getMIMEType. So let's go inside the folder, create our file, So this function will take the extension and then we'll run some code which will give us the MIME type if everything goes well. So let's set the module.exports to our function like that. Now, to get the MIME type for a certain extension, you can use an external JSON file which includes pairs of extensions and their corresponding MIME type. So if you Google file extension to MIME types JSON and add this name, ArchHesks, then the first link will take you to this GitHub webpage. So if you click on row, this will take you to the JSON file that you'd like to use. So you can see here the extensions on the left hand side and the corresponding MIME type on the right hand side. Now, if you like, you can download this file to your project and use it straight away. Otherwise, you can send requests to this link using the get method of HTTPS, because it's using HTTPS here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy this link and store it inside a variable that I'm going to call MIME URL. And we're going to use this link later on in our function to get the MIME type. Now, as we said earlier, we want our function getMIMEType to return a promise. So let's return a promise. So we're going to create a promise using new promise, and this will take a function with a couple of parameters. So resolve and reject. And then we're going to run some code, and then we will decide whether we're going to resolve or reject our promise. Now, to get the content of the JSON file, we're going to use the HTTPS module because the file or the link uses HTTPS. And then we're going to use the get method of HTTPS. Now, if you want, you can go to the Node website or Node documentation, and then look for HTTPS. And now if you type https.get, this will show you the correct way of using HTTPS. So you pass to it your URL and then a function which will take care of the response. And then at the end, you handle errors using the on method. All right. So let's copy this code and then customize it for our project. And we will need to include the module at the top of our files. So here we're going to have our URL, which is MIME URL, and then let's call this response. Now let's test our code by resolving the response status code. So I'm going to delete these lines and I'm going to resolve response.status code and then return so that we don't execute the other lines. So let's try this. So let's try, for example, media and this one. Okay, so the status code is 200. So this means that the request has been successful. Now let's try an incorrect link. And now we got 500. So you see that's because it's been waiting for a response. It didn't get a response. Okay. So 500 for the response status code, and you will still see that because we're not sending any response to the web page. All right. Now to make it better, let's go back to our respond.js file, and instead of just logging the MIME, let's set the response status code to 200 and write something like status code in the get MIME type function. Is this. And then return response.end. So basically, instead of sending the MIME, we're sending actually the response status. All right, and we are printing it on the web page. So in this scenario, we've got 500. Now, if we go back to the correct link, then we're going to get 200. Now, even if your link is correct, there are still some possible errors that you may get. And normally, when you get an error, your status code is going to be less than 200 strictly or greater than 299. So what you can do, you can create an if statement with that condition. So less than 200 or greater than 299. So in that case, you're going to reject the promise with an error. So for example, let's write error failed to load MIME types JSON file. And you can also add the response status code like that. You can also console.log the same thing. Right, and by the way, even if you reject your promise, the code coming after the reject statement is still going to be executed, unless you add a return statement like this to make sure the code doesn't carry on. Okay, so let's delete this for now. And let's address the other scenario where the status code is fine. So in this case, you're going to add an event, data, and normally you will receive data by chunks. So let's change this to response. And basically every time the data event fires, you're receiving a chunk of data. So I'm going to call this chunk. And you decide what you want to do with that chunk of data. So a practical way would be to create a data variable. I'm going to set it to an empty string. So sometimes you will find this as an array and it's manipulated later on as an array, but you can use a string in our scenario. So now what we want to do with this chunk of data, we will just add it to our data string like this. All right, so you will receive data by chunks. Now, at the end, once you receive all your data, the event which will fire is end. So on end, let's execute another function. So this time it's not going to take any parameter. And basically, here you are going to resolve your promise. And you send the MIME type. So to guess the MIME type, we're going to pass our JSON content. So this will convert your content to an array. And then you're going to use the extension as the key to get the correct MIME type. So let's save and try our code. So let's try this file. And we can see here that the MIME type is video/MP4. Let's try another one. Here you go, audio, MPEG. Let's try an HTML file, text/HTML, a text file, text/plain. Now let's try an extension that is not recognized. Okay, and now it says 404 file not found. Obviously, that file doesn't exist on the server. So before we arrive to the stage of getting the extension, it will stop at the stage of looking for the path of the file and concluding that it doesn't exist. All right. Now that you know the MIME type of the file, you are ready to serve the file to the user. And that's what you're going to do in the next video.